15th of March, 1941. The North Atlantic churned with a malevolence that matched the unseen terror lurking beneath its surface. Commander Frederick John Walker stood on the bridge of HMS Stork, his weathered face illuminated by the dim red glow of the navigation lights, watching another merchant convoy scatter like frightened sheep as yet another U-boat strike tore through their formation. 3 ships gone in 40 minutes. 300 souls swallowed by the black water. The statistical reality gnawed at him. For every German submarine sunk, the Kriegsmarine was destroying 17 Allied vessels. At this rate, Britain would starve before summer's end. Walker was no stranger to failure. At 49 years old, he had watched younger, more politically connected officers climb past him while he languished in what the Admiralty considered backwater postings. His promotion to commander had come late, his assignment to anti-submarine warfare even later. The Royal Navy's old guard viewed him as too methodical, too obsessed with what they dismissively called mathematical naval warfare. But obsession, Walker believed, was precisely what the Battle of the Atlantic demanded. The conventional depth-charge attack pattern had remained essentially unchanged since the Great War. Ships would pass over a suspected U-boat position and roll charges off the stern in a straight line, set to detonate at estimated depths. Simple, traditional, and, as Walker's meticulous records proved, catastrophically ineffective, according to documentation referenced in Naval Historian. John Terrain's Business in Great Waters, the kill rate for depth-charge attacks in early 1941 hovered below 8%. German submariners had learned to exploit the pattern's predictability, diving deep and turning hard the moment they heard propellers overhead. Walker's cabin aboard Stork resembled an academic study more than a warrior's quarters. Charts covered every surface, each marked with colored pins representing EU boat encounters, attack patterns, and outcomes. He had analyzed 217 separate engagements, timing the interval between a submarine's dive and the moment depth charges detonated. The average was 45 seconds an eternity for a U-boat captain with nerves of steel and a competent crew. In those 45 seconds, a submarine running at flank speed could travel nearly 200 yards from its last known position. The mathematics were brutally simple, a straight-line pattern. No matter how many charges it employed, created a narrow corridor of destruction. A U-boat needed only to deviate slightly from its original course to escape unscathed. Walker sketched endlessly, calculating blast radiuses, water pressure variables, and the geometry of probability. His fellow officers thought him mad. His own first lieutenant had quietly inquired whether the commander might benefit from shore leave. But Walker saw something they did not. He envisioned depth charges not as individual weapons, but as a three-dimensional grid of overlapping kill zones. If charges detonated simultaneously at varying depths and positions, they would create a spherical wall of pressure that could crush a submarine's pressure hull regardless of its evasive maneuvers. The pattern would need to be massive, simultaneous. And here was the truly radical part, deployed not just from the attacking ship's stern, but from multiple vessels at coordinated positions. The plan required resources the Admiralty was loath to spare. Additional escort ships working in concert. Specialized throwing equipment to hurl charges laterally rather than simply rolling them astern. And wireless coordination precise enough to ensure simultaneous detonation within fractions of a second. When Walker first presented his proposal to Western Approaches Command in Liverpool, the response had been swift and dismissive. Rear Admiral Percy Noble had actually laughed, calling the scheme geometrically insane and questioning whether Walker understood the difference between theoretical mathematics and practical warfare. Yet as spring gave way to summer, and the convoy losses mounted 60 ships in April alone, 98 in May desperation began to crack the Admiralty's institutional rigidity. Britain's food reserves dwindled to 6 weeks. Churchill himself had declared the U-boat menace the only thing that ever really frightened me during the war. 23rd of June, 1941. Summons arrived by dispatch rider at 0400 hours. Commander Walker was to report to Derby House, the headquarters of Western Approaches Command, immediately upon Stork's return to Liverpool. Walker suspected either a court-martial for his repeated violations of standard attack doctrine, or, less likely, someone had actually read his reports. The reality proved stranger than either scenario. Captain Donald McIntyre, one of the Royal Navy's rising stars in anti-submarine warfare, had independently reached conclusions eerily similar to Walker's. McIntyre's escort group had recently achieved two U-boat kills using what he termed creeping attacks, methodical multi-ship approaches that boxed submarines into increasingly smaller areas. The Admiralty's tactical division wanted the two commanders to collaborate, though collaborate was perhaps too generous a word for what amounted to a last-ditch experiment with minimal official support. Walker threw himself into the work with the intensity of a man granted unexpected reprieve. He commandeered a classroom at the Western Approach's tactical unit, covering 3 blackboards with diagrams that looked more like molecular structures than naval tactics. The key, he explained to a skeptical audience of junior officers, lay in understanding the U-boat's defensive options. According to intelligence reports from captured German submariners, formation Walker had obtained from interrogation transcripts at the prisoner of war facility, U-boat commanders followed predictable patterns when under attack. First, they would dive immediately, typically to depths between 150 to 200 feet, where they believed themselves safe from shallow-set charges. Second, they would execute a hard turn, usually to starboard because of propeller torque dynamics. Third, they would reduce speed to minimize noise, making them harder to track on ASDIC, the Royal Navy's primary underwater detection equipment. These weren't conscious decisions so much as trained reflexes, drilled into every U-boat captain at the submarine school in Neustadt. Walker's proposed pattern, which he formally designated the creeping attack system, but which sailors would soon nickname Walker's Madness, exploited each of these reflexive responses. The pattern required corvettes or destroyers working in coordination. The first vessel, designated the directing ship, would maintain a stack contact with the submerged U-boat, following at a distance of approximately 1,000 yards, close enough to track, but far enough to avoid alerting the submarine to imminent attack. The second vessel, the attacking ship, would approach from a different bearing at minimal speed, so slowly that its propeller noise would barely register on the U-boat's hydrophones. This glacial approach, typically no more than 3 knots required, extraordinary seamanship in the North Atlantic's turbulent waters. Helmsmen had to maintain precise positioning based on continuous wireless updates from the directing ship, compensating for wind, current, and the target's movements. The actual attack pattern bore no resemblance to conventional doctrine. Rather than releasing charges in a linear sequence, the attacking ship would deploy 14 depth charges in a diamond configuration, 2 charges set for 50 feet, 4 for 100 feet, 6 for 150 feet, and 2 for 200 feet. The charges would be released using a combination of stern rails and newly installed throwers, Kagon projectors that could hurl charges up to 70 yards laterally, when detonated simultaneously. These 14 charges created what Walker called a lethal envelope, a roughly spherical zone of overlapping pressure waves, measuring approximately 100 yards in diameter, according to Walker's calculations, referenced in documents from the Admiralty's Tactical School archives. The combined overpressure within this envelope would exceed 12,000 pounds per square inch at the center, more than sufficient to rupture a Type 7 U-boat's pressure hole, even at maximum rated depth. The pattern's simultaneity was crucial. Sequential detonations, like the traditional stern-dropped pattern, gave pressure waves time to dissipate and allowed water to rush back into the void, cushioning subsequent explosions. But 14 charges detonating within a 2-second window would create multiple pressure fronts that reinforced each other, generating what physicists call constructive interference. The water itself became a weapon, transmitting crushing force in all directions. Critics and there were many raised to primary objections. First, the pattern consumed 14 depth charges per attack, compared to 5 or 6 in conventional approaches. With depth charge production struggling to meet demand, such profligacy seemed unconscionable. Walker countered with cold mathematics. If the pattern doubled the kill rate, it would actually reduce depth charge expenditure per U-boat sunk by 30%. Second, the creeping approach left the attacking ship vulnerable for extended periods, sometimes 20 minutes or more, during which it moved at minimal speed and thus couldn't evade torpedo attack. This second objection, Walker acknowledged but considered acceptable. "We must choose," he wrote in a memo that would later become famous, "between the risk of losing 1 corvette and the certainty of losing 10 merchantmen." 17th of September, 1941. 8. Walker's opportunity came not through official channels, but through the grim mathematics of attrition. The second escort group, originally slated for a more experienced commander, had lost its designated leader when HMS Sabre took a torpedo amidships off Rockall Bank. Walker received his orders at dawn. He would take command of Stork and 5 corvettes: HMS Marigold, HMS Convolvulus, HMS Gardenia, HMS Penstman, and HMS Vetch with immediate effect. Their mission: shepherd convoy HG-73 from Gibraltar to Liverpool. The crossing began inauspiciously. 32 merchant vessels, laden with copper, cork, and iron ore from North Africa, wallowed through moderate seas under low clouds that reduced visibility to less than 2 miles. The convoy's commodore, a retired admiral named Cuthbert, made clear his skepticism about Walker's theoretical innovations during their pre-sailing conference. "I've been crossing this pond since before you were born, Commander," Cuthbert had said, jabbing a weathered finger at Walker's chest. "Fancy patterns don't sink U-boats. Depth charges do." For 3 days, Walker drilled his escort group in the creeping attack technique. The corvette commanders, most in their mid-20s, reservists from civilian life, approached the exercises with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Lieutenant Commander Roland Wemyss of Marigold grasped the concept immediately, having studied mathematics at Cambridge before the war. Others found the precise coordination and glacial approach speeds counterintuitive to every instinct that said attack with speed and fury. The Germans found them on the 4th night, 2200 hours. A brilliant flash erupted on the convoy's starboard quarter as U-433, commanded by Captain-Lieutenant Hanzai, put 2 torpedoes into the cargo ship Ariosto. The British vessel, carrying 7,000 tons of copper ingots, went down in under 4 minutes. Walker, on Stork's bridge, felt the familiar rage and frustration rise in his chest, then forced it down. Emotion, he had learned, was the enemy of effective tactics. Stork's ASDIC operator, able seaman Thomas Edwards, a former trawlerman from Grimsby, picked up the submarine's acoustic signature almost immediately. A skilled operator could distinguish U-boat screws from the convoy's merchant engines by subtle variations in pitch and rhythm. Walker issued rapid orders. Marigold would serve as directing ship, maintaining ASDIC contact while Stork executed the attack approach. What followed tested every assumption underlying Walker's mathematical theories. As Stork crept forward at 3 knots, barely maintaining steerage, the U-boat commander demonstrated why the Kriegsmarine had terrorized the Atlantic for 2 years. U-433 went deep. Deeper than Walker had anticipated. Day's SDIC readings suggested 250 feet, pushing the limits of a Type 7's crush depth. Then the submarine did something unexpected. Rather than turning to starboard, Captain-Lieutenant, I turned hard to port and actually increased speed, gambling that the British would assume a conventional defensive response. Walker, however, wasn't relying on assumptions. He was following the ASDIC operator's continuous readings, transmitted by wireless from Marigold. The beauty of the creeping attack was its adaptability, because the attacking ship moved slowly and maintained contact. Through the directing vessel, last-second corrections were possible. When Edwards reported the U-boat's port turn, Walker adjusted Stork's approach bearing by 15 degrees. At 2312 hours, Stork reached the release point. Walker gave the order. Pattern released. 14 depth chargers, 7 rolled from stern rails. 7 hurled by Kagan throwers arced into the black water. The crew counted down. 10 seconds. 9, 8. At the 7-second mark, the ocean erupted. Contemporary accounts, preserved in Stork's deck log at the National Archives in Kew, describe the detonations as a single prolonged explosion that lifted the stern clear of the water. The sea boiled white, throwing spray higher than the corvette's mast. Then, in the phosphorescent glow of the disturbed water, something no British sailor had seen in months: debris, planking, a boot. Oil, thick and black, spreading across the surface. The confirmation came minutes later, when a larger object broke the surfacer section of pressure hull, approximately 20 feet long, bearing the painted designation U-433. 21st of September, 1941. The wreckage of U-433 told a story that silenced even Walker's harshest critics. Royal Navy divers, working from a salvage vessel dispatched from Gibraltar, recovered enough of the submarine to piece together its final moments. The pressure hull had failed catastrophically at 3 separate points simultaneously. Precisely what Walker's overlapping charge pattern was designed to achieve. According to the salvage report archived at the Admiralty's historical section, the blast damage indicated detonations at multiple depths, creating what metallurgists termed coincident stress fractures. Captain Lieutenant Hanzai and his entire crew of 44 men died instantly when the North Atlantic, compressed to crushing density by 14 simultaneous explosions, punched through their steel shelter like a fist through paper. It was in one sense a merciful death, faster and less terrifying than drowning in a flooding compartment or suffocating as oxygen ran out. But it was also proof, undeniable and irrefutable, that Walker's geometrically insane pattern worked. News of the kills spread through the Royal Navy's anti-submarine community with the speed of signal flags on a clear day. The Admiralty's initial response was characteristically bureaucratic: terse acknowledgement of innovative tactical employment of standard weaponry and authorization for Walker to continue experimental approaches under operational conditions. But among the corvette and destroyer commanders actually fighting the Battle of the Atlantic, the response was electric. Officers who had dismissed Walker as a mathematical crank now flooded Western Approach's command with requests for transfer to his escort group. The Germans, meanwhile, faced a more troubling question. What had killed U-433? British depth charge attacks had grown deadlier throughout 1941, but this represented something qualitatively different. Survivors from other U-boats that had endured near-miss attacks reported the typical pattern: a line of explosions that a skillful commander could evade with aggressive maneuvering. But the few hydrophone recordings recovered from U-boats that escaped Walker's subsequent attacks suggested something: unprecedented simultaneous detonations creating a sphere of destruction. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the U-boat fleet from his headquarters in Paris, noted the changing tactical environment in his war diary entry for the 23rd of September. Enemy anti-submarine methods show signs of sophistication, he wrote, in an assessment that would prove grimly prescient. Commanders must exercise extreme caution when depth charged. The British appear to have developed coordinated attack patterns. Dönitz, himself a U-boat commander during the Great War, understood underwater warfare's deadly geometry better than most. He ordered tactical modifications, deeper dives, more aggressive evasion, and absolute wireless silence during attacks. These countermeasures came too late for U-501. On the 1st of October, 1941, Walker's escort group was shepherding convoy OS-4 from Liverpool toward Freetown when Marigold's ASDIC operator detected a submarine shadowing the convoy's port flank. Oberleutnant Sir C. Hugo Farster, commanding U-501, was young, just 26, and aggressive. Having sunk 4 Allied ships in his first 2 patrols, his confidence proved fatal. Following Walker's no-refined procedure, Stork served as directing ship, while Convolvulus, under Lieutenant Commander Gordon Peyton, crept into attack position. Farster detected Convolvulus's approach too late. Executing a crash dive that took U-501 to 300 feet, dangerously deep, beyond the rated crush depth, but Farster gambled that the British wouldn't set charges for such depths. He gambled wrong. Peyton's pattern, adjusted based on the extreme depth reading, placed 2 charges at 250 feet and 4 at 300 feet. The detonations crushed U-501's after compartment, flooding the engine room and jamming the diving planes in the full dive position. The submarine plunged past 400 feet before the pressure hull failed completely. Once again, there were no survivors. Once again, oil and debris marked the kill. 2 U-boats in 3 weeks. The news reached Winston Churchill during a War Cabinet meeting on the 3rd of October. The Prime Minister, who had been following Walker's unconventional career with interest, sent a personal memorandum to Admiral Noble. This officer is to be given whatever resources he requires. The U-boat must be defeated, and Commander Walker appears to understand how. It was the kind of political backing that could transform a maverick into a mainstream success or set him up for a spectacular public failure. 19th of October, 1941. The true test of Walker's system came not against lone submarines, but against the wolf pack, the coordinated group tactics that Dönitz had perfected into a science of mass destruction. Convoy C-48, plodding westward from Halifax with 38 merchant ships, found itself targeted by Wolfpack Schley. 9 U-boats, formed in a picket line stretching 200 miles across the convoy's projected route. Walker's second escort group had been reinforced, a tacit acknowledgement of his success, and now included 7 vessels: Stork, Marigold, Convolvulus, Gardenia, Pensman, Vetch, and the destroyer, HMS Vanquisher. It was still woefully inadequate for protecting 38 merchantmen against 9 submarines. But it was 3 more escorts than most convoys received. The Wolfpack's initial attack came at dusk on the 19th, the Germans' preferred time. When the setting sun silhouetted targets while submarines remained invisible in the darkening water, U-432, commanded by Capitan Lieutenant Hermann Eckart, struck first, torpedoing the freighter Everla. The ship, loaded with timber from Nova Scotia, actually remained afloat for 90 minutes, its buoyant cargo keeping it on the surface, even as water flooded its holds. The crew had time to abandon ship in good order, rare mercy in the North Atlantic's unforgiving environment. But Eckart's success brought the Wolfpack swarming. Within 30 minutes, 4 more U-boats converged on the convoy, drawn by Eckart's sighting report transmitted on the secure Enigma frequency. This was the scenario Walker had wargamed repeatedly, multiple submarines attacking from different bearings, each capable of launching a spread of 4 torpedoes before diving deep. The conventional escort response was to scatter, each vessel chasing its assigned target, while the convoy fragmented into chaos. Walker chose the opposite approach. Keying his wireless transmitter, he issued rapid orders. Vanquisher and Gardenia would screen the convoy's van and flanks. Deterring surface approaches, the remaining 5 escorts would form hunter-killer pairs, with Walker himself coordinating their efforts from Stork's Bridge. It was essentially the creeping attack system scaled up to Wolfpack dimensions, turning the Germans' own coordinated tactics against them. The key was patience. Rather than rushing to depth charge every ASDIC contact, Walker's escorts would track submarines methodically, waiting for optimal attack positions, even if it meant allowing U-boats to maneuver for minutes at a time. The risk was enormous. Every minute spent setting up a perfect attack was a minute during which torpedoes might strike home. But Walker had done the mathematics. A hasty attack had an 8% kill probability. His pattern, when properly executed, had demonstrated 40% success rates in the past month's engagements. At 2100 hours, Marigold gained solid ASDIC contact on a submarine running submerged at 120 feet, bearing 090 degrees relative to the convoy. Walker detached Pensman to execute the attack, with Marigold maintaining the directing role. The U-boat, later identified as U-532 under Oberleutnant Klaus Bargstein, attempted the standard evasive pattern: deep dive, hard turn to starboard, speed reduction. Pensman's commander, Lieutenant Commander Jack Fiegel, had participated in every one of Walker's training exercises. His approach was textbook perfect: 3 knots forward speed, continuous course corrections based on Marigold's wireless updates, pattern released at the calculated optimal position. The detonations came at 2116 hours. This time, however, there was no immediate debris. The ocean boiled and settled. Oil appeared, always oil, but no conclusive evidence of a kill. Then, 40 seconds after the explosions, a different sound reached Pensman's hydrophone operator, the distinctive screech of tearing metal. Transmitted through water with crystal clarity, U-532's pressure hull, weakened by near-miss concussions, had failed during an emergency blow attempt. Bargstein had tried to surface, to save his crew, but the damaged hull couldn't withstand the rapid pressure change. The submarine broke apart at 180 feet. 22 men made it to the surface. 23 did not. The engagement lasted 7 hours. By dawn on the 20th of October, Walker's escorts had executed 11 creeping attacks against 7 different U-boats. 3 submarines were confirmed destroyed. 2 more were so heavily damaged that they were forced to break off and limp back to Lorient, effectively removed from combat for months. The convoy lost 5 merchantmen, a grievous toll, but less than half the expected casualty rate against a 9-boat Wolfpack. Dunitz, reviewing the battle reports from his surviving commanders, noted with alarm, British anti-submarine effectiveness has increased markedly. Attack patterns suggest coordinated tactics and possibly new weapons. 6th of November, 1941. The ornate conference room at Derby House held an audience Walker had spent his career dreaming of and simultaneously dreading. 16 senior officers, including Admiral Noble, and representatives from the Admiralty's Tactical Division, Anti-Submarine Warfare Department, and Research and Development Section, had assembled to hear Walker present his tactical innovations. Gone was the dismissive mockery of his earlier proposals. The room's atmosphere carried the brittle tension of institutional orthodoxy, confronting undeniable results. Walker had never been comfortable with public-speaking mathematics, and tactics were his languages. Not rhetoric, but he understood the stakes. His success needed to scale beyond a single escort group. The Battle of the Atlantic was being lost at an unsustainable rate. Over 300 Allied ships sunk in 1941, against fewer than 30 U-boats destroyed. If Walker's methods could be disseminated throughout the escort forces, the mathematics of attrition might finally tilt in Britain's favor. He began with the statistics, letting the numbers speak their brutal truth. In the period from 1st of September to 31st of October, the 2nd Escort Group conducted 17 depth charge attacks. 7 resulted in confirmed kills, 3 in probable kills, and 4 in heavy damage requiring the target to withdraw from combat operations. This represents a success rate of approximately 41% confirmed, 65% including probables, and 82% if we count operational mission kills. The silence that followed was profound. Captain Colin Jim Stevens, director of the Anti-Submarine Warfare Division, leaned forward. "Commander, you're aware that the service-wide average for the same period was 9% confirmed kills?" "I am aware, sir, and you attribute this improvement entirely to your modified attack pattern." "Not entirely, sir. 3 factors contribute. The pattern itself, the creeping approach that allows precise positioning, and crew training in coordinated wireless tactics. Remove any one element, and effectiveness drops significantly." What followed was 3 hours of detailed technical discussion. Walker demonstrated with scale models how the diamond pattern created overlapping pressure zones. He presented hydrophone recordings from attacks, showing the distinctive acoustic signature of simultaneous versus sequential detonations. He walked through the geometry of the creeping approach, explaining why slow speed paradoxically increased attack effectiveness, despite seeming to violate basic tactical doctrine about maintaining momentum and speed. The skeptics, and there were still skeptics, raised predictable objections. Commander Philip Vian, a conventional tactician of considerable reputation, argued that the pattern's complexity made it unsuitable for rapid training of new escort commanders. "You've demonstrated success with a hand-picked, extensively drilled group," Vian said. "But we're commissioning new corvettes every fortnight, crewed by reservists who've never seen a submarine except in newsreels. They need simple, robust tactics, not mathematical puzzles." Walker had anticipated this argument. "Sir, with respect, the issue isn't complexity, but novelty. Once internalized, the creeping attack becomes as instinctive as any other tactical procedure." Lieutenant Commander Fiel executed a perfect attack during the SC-48 engagement while under torpedo attack himself in darkness, with damaged wireless equipment. The pattern held because the underlying geometry is sound. The debate continued through lunch and into the afternoon. 2 camps emerged: progressives who saw Walker's methods as the potential solution to the convoy crisis, and conservatives who worried about disrupting established procedures during wartime. The meeting broke with no firm conclusions, but Admiral Noble pulled Walker aside afterward. "You've made believers of enough of them," Noble said quietly. "We'll authorize expanded trials. We'll receive 8 more escort vessels and permission to establish a training program at Tobermory. But understand, Commander, if your next convoy goes badly, the knives will be out. Success has given you credibility, but one disaster will brand you a dangerous innovator who got lucky a few times." Walker understood perfectly. He had moved from the periphery to the spotlight, and spotlights illuminated failures as brilliantly as they did successes. The training program began on the 15th of November at the Royal Navy base at Tobermory. On the Isle of Mull, Walker insisted on teaching the course himself, despite having command responsibilities. Over 3 intensive days, escort commanders learned the creeping attack through repetition and simulation. Walker had arranged for a retired submarine, HMS H-31, to serve as a mobile training target. Commanders practiced the painstaking approach, the wireless coordination, the split-second timing of pattern release. Not everyone succeeded immediately. Lieutenant David Eames, assigned to the newly commissioned corvette, HMS Arbutus, struggled with the slow-speed ship handling required for the approach. On his fourth practice run, Eames lost control in a quartering sea and nearly rammed the submarine. Walker, watching from Stork, transmitted a message that became legendary in escort circles. Eames, your mathematics are perfect, and your ship handling resembles a drunken walrus. We'll work on the latter. By the end of the training period, Eames had mastered the technique and would go on to sink to U-boats the following spring. 3rd of December, 1941. Winter in the North Atlantic transformed the Battle of the Atlantic from a strategic challenge into a test of human endurance. Waves 40 feet high, winds exceeding gale force for days at a time, visibility measured in yards rather than miles. These conditions would have been dangerous enough without enemy submarines hunting in the darkness. The smaller corvettes, designed for coastal work and pressed into ocean convoy duty through desperate necessity, pitched and rolled with such violence that crews couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't remain at their stations without lashing themselves in place. Walker's expanded 2nd Escort Group now numbered 15 vessels, making it one of the largest dedicated anti-submarine formations in the Royal Navy. The group had been assigned to the Western Approaches Commands, its most hazardous duty, the Gibraltar Run, where convoys passed through U-boat patrol zones concentrated around the Bay of Biscay. Dönitz had reinforced these areas with his most experienced commanders, creating what German submariners called the Death Zone, 200 miles where attack was almost guaranteed. On the 5th of December, convoy HG-76 departed Gibraltar, 32 merchantmen carrying war materials from North Africa and the Mediterranean. Walker's intelligence briefing warned of 8 U-boats definitely positioned along the route, possibly more. The weather forecast was equally grim, a major storm system moving east-northeast. With winds forecast at force 9 and seas building to 30-foot swells, the Germans struck on the first night before the storm arrived in full force. U-537, commanded by Capitan Lieutenant Peter Shrew, torpedoed the cargo ship Rucking at 2200 hours. The vessel's bow disintegrated, and she went down in 4 minutes. The destroyer HMS Stanley, on the convoy's port flank, picked up 17 survivors from the freezing water. Walker immediately implemented his tactical response, rather than charging toward the torpedo track in the traditional counterattack. He positioned 3 escorts Stork, Marigold, and Convolvulus, a triangular formation around the estimated attack position. The triangle's geometry allowed simultaneous ASTIC coverage from multiple bearings, making it nearly impossible for a submarine to slip away undetected. Convolvulus gained contact first, a solid echo at 1,000 yards. Bearing 270 degrees, depth estimated at 150 feet. But before Walker could initiate a creeping attack, the storm arrived. Within 15 minutes, wind speed doubled, seas turned chaotic, and visibility dropped to near zero. The carefully choreographed coordination that made Walker's pattern so effective suddenly became nearly impossible to execute. Walker faced a grim choice. Attempt the attack in conditions that made precise wireless coordination and slow-speed maneuvering extremely hazardous. Or break off and accept that U-537 would remain a threat to the convoy. He chose to attack. "If we wait for perfect conditions," he said to his first lieutenant, "the submarines will sink every ship we're meant to protect." The engagement that followed tested every assumption about Walker's system. Marigold, serving as directing ship, fought to maintain a stick contact as 30-foot swells lifted her hull partially clear of the water, causing the ASTIC dome to lose contact during each wave trough. Stork, creeping forward at 3 knots, struggled to maintain steerage as quartering seas pushed her bow off course. On the bridge, Walker compensated manually, issuing rapid helm corrections based on his intuitive grasp of the submarine's likely position. At 2332 hours, Stork released her pattern. The detonations came irregularly. The storm had scattered the depth charges during their descent, disrupting